In the Gnostic view, divine law is not a mandate imposed from without, but a luminous architecture unfolding from within. The Logos, word, pattern, wisdom, is not merely spoken in time, but inscribed eternally into the soul and cosmos alike. Scripture, when interpreted through the lens of gnosis, ceases to be a text of rules and becomes a map of return, a sacred cipher revealing the soul's descent from and path back to the divine fullness, pleroma. This true law is not moralism but metaphysics, not compliance but correspondence. It encodes the essential resonance between human consciousness and divine structure, guiding the soul from fragmentation toward coherence, from ignorance, agnoia, to knowing, gnosis. To read with the eye of the Spirit is to recognize that the law is the Logos, and the Logos is the soul's mirror, a call to remembrance, a template for reintegration. Thus the law is not given to govern but to reveal. It does not constrain, it discloses the hidden symmetry by which the eons themselves are ordered. In awakening to this law, the soul does not submit, it harmonizes. In following it, the soul does not obey, it remembers. This is not a return to religious dogma, but a return to divine memory. In Matthew 1:17, the genealogy of Christ is presented not as a mere ancestral list, but as a multidimensional symbol system, a Gnostic schema of the soul's descent, ordeal, and return. Beneath its historical cover lies an esoteric template, a triadic movement through 42 archetypal names forming a cosmic spiral of transformation. This structure does not describe the genealogy of flesh alone. It encodes the genealogy of the inner human, the anthropos, from fragmented self to embodied logos. Each name is a spiritual threshold, a symbolic station in the soul's odyssey through the planes of becoming. The tripartite division, Abraham to David, David to the exile to Christ, mirrors the universal Gnostic arc. From the first divine spark, through entrapment in the psychic and hylic realms, to the full reawakening of the pneumatic essence in union with the indwelling Christos. This is the arc of cosmic descent, psychic crucifixion, and spiritual resurrection. This is not a genealogy bound to time, but a mystical cartography of consciousness. It is the unfolding of the Logos within, the journey of the inner Christ through ignorance, memory, rupture, and healing, until the fullness of divinity is born not just in history, but in the awakened heart. Read rightly, the names are not records of the past, but activations in the present. They are glyphs, archetypes, sacraments of inner movement. To contemplate Matthew's genealogy through the Gnostic lens is to read Scripture not as narrative, but as gnosis. Each syllable becomes a luminous gate. Each stage becomes a fractal in the soul's awakening. The final revelation is this: the Christ born at the end of the list is not external to us, but the deep self remembered, the Logos within, emerging from the spiral of names as the soul's divine rebecoming. The journey begins with Abraham, whose Hebrew name signifies father of multitudes. At this foundational stage, the soul first hears its divine calling, intuitively recognizing its role in the unfolding of a greater purpose. The spiritual journey starts when the individual glimpses that life holds a transcendent purpose beyond mere physical existence, an awakening to the presence of divine potential within oneself and the cosmos. From calling, one moves to Isaac, whose name means he will laugh, signifying joy discovered after deep suffering or spiritual trial. Isaac represents the first experience of spiritual delight and divine humor, recognizing that trials are not merely obstacles but integral to growth, allowing joy and divine perspective to emerge in unexpected ways. This joy gives way to struggle with Jacob, the heel grasper. Jacob symbolizes the necessary wrestling with ego, the stage of inner tension where the individual confronts and grapples with their shadows, attachments, and false identities. The soul must actively engage and challenge itself to shed ego-driven limitations before it can truly transform. From struggle arises the openness of praise through Judah, meaning praised. Judah signifies the soul's surrender and the initiation into gratitude and devotion, recognizing divinity not just as external power, but as an inner guiding reality. Praise becomes a gateway that allows deeper spiritual receptivity and the relinquishing of personal control. This openness then brings Perez, the breakthrough. Perez symbolizes a critical juncture where old boundaries and spiritual barriers rupture, creating space for expansive spiritual growth. Crisis becomes a moment of spiritual birth, painful yet essential for progress, forcing the individual into larger awareness and capacity for divine connection. Yet immediately after the breakthrough comes the necessity of spiritual containment, embodied by Hezron, meaning enclosure. Hezron represents forming an inner sanctuary, an internal sacred space where spiritual awareness is nurtured, stabilized, and protected from external fragmentation or internal disorder. It is here the soul cultivates stillness, reflection, and intimacy with the divine. Then comes elevation through Ram, signifying exalted. At this point, the soul rises above earlier limitations, glimpsing transcendent visions and higher ideals. This elevation helps the individual perceive existence from a spiritually expansive vantage point beyond immediate personal needs or material desires. This exalted perspective leads naturally to integration of ancestral nobility through Aminadab, whose name translates as, "My kinsman is noble." Aminadab's spiritual stage is accepting and reconciling with one's ancestral lineage, both its strengths and shadows, thus integrating personal history into a larger story of spiritual nobility, accepting one's place within a divine lineage beyond biological ties alone. Next, the soul moves into mystery with Nashon, the enchanter. Here, spiritual knowledge deepens beyond rational intellect into intuition and inner knowing. This is initiation into the mysteries, the hidden wisdom that only becomes visible when one walks by faith, intuition, and spiritual insight rather than logic or mere tradition. This initiatory understanding brings awareness of true identity through Salmon, meaning clothing. Salmon represents recognizing the masks and roles the soul wears, distinguishing between external persona and true divine essence. Spiritual authenticity is realized by shedding superficial coverings and accepting the authentic divine self beneath. With this clarity comes inner stability and virtue represented by Boaz, meaning strength. Here the individual becomes spiritually grounded, stable, and reliably virtuous. Strength no longer comes from external validation or pride, but from rootedness in spiritual truth, quiet confidence, and moral clarity. Having strength firmly grounded, the soul can now move into genuine humility and service through Obed, whose name means serving. Obed symbolizes willing participation in divine purpose, surrendering personal ambition for spiritual service, recognizing true power resides in selfless giving and devotion to the divine will. This humility invites a further receptivity to grace, represented by Jesse, meaning gift. Jesse marks a stage of spiritual realization that life itself is a divine gift, and the soul opens fully to receive blessings not as personal accomplishments, but as expressions of unconditional divine generosity and providence. Finally, the journey culminates in David, whose Hebrew name means beloved. At David's stage, the soul achieves its first full conscious union with the divine, fully loved and fully integrated into a higher divine identity. The struggle, praise, breakthrough, containment, and humility now converge into an experiential knowing of the soul as divine beloved. David symbolizes a profound internal unity, marking a completion of the initial spiritual triad, the awakening to belovedness. This first 14-step arc, Abraham to David, is an essential process of spiritual initiation. It guides the soul from initial awakening and joy through struggle and integration, concluding in the profound realization of divine union. But this belovedness is just the first realization. The journey ahead leads through testing, refinement, deeper purification, and ultimately toward a total embodiment of the divine Logos. The second arc commences with Solomon, meaning peace. At this stage, the soul experiences an initial sense of harmonization and internal balance, seemingly having achieved spiritual maturity. Yet this state of peace, though genuine, proves temporary, a necessary prelude to deeper tests and trials that will follow, demonstrating the fragility of early spiritual stability. Following peace, the soul encounters expansive potential through Rehoboam, translated as the people expand. Here, spiritual identity expands beyond prior limits, which initially seems positive but simultaneously introduces the danger of spiritual inflation. The soul may become over-identified with its newfound spiritual strength or knowledge, risking pride or self-delusion. The correction arrives sharply with Abijah, meaning my father is Yah. In this phase, the soul reconnects more intensely with its true inheritance, its divine origin. This recognition, however, initiates deep inner questioning, prompting the individual to discern true spiritual identity from ego-based illusions, thus instigating a challenging but necessary introspective descent. Healing emerges through Asa, meaning healer. Here, the individual directly confronts inner wounds, generational patterns, and shadow aspects of self that were previously concealed or denied. The process of spiritual healing, often painful and unsettling, initiates genuine renewal, requiring honesty and courage in acknowledging hidden pains. Next, Jehoshaphat, whose name means Yahweh has judged, signifies the spiritual stage of discernment and divine evaluation. At this point, the soul undergoes a profound inner accounting, aligning itself consciously with divine justice and truth. Old moral compromises and self-deceptions are revealed and assessed, prompting purification through spiritual accountability. This discernment leads to surrender through Joram, meaning exalted is Yahweh. The soul acknowledges its powerlessness apart from divine grace. Egoic pride breaks as the individual yields to the supremacy of divine authority, thus experiencing liberation through humility. This surrender is not defeat, it is voluntary submission to higher divine will. In humility, the soul receives empowered stillness through Uzziah, translating as my strength is Yah. Rather than acting from egoic willfulness, the individual learns to draw on divine strength in silence and inner calm. Stillness replaces restless striving, offering a deeper reliance upon the divine rather than personal ambition or power. This reliance ushers the soul into an encounter with divine perfection through Jotham, meaning Yahweh is perfect. Confronted with divine perfection, the soul experiences humility and awe in facing the limitless purity and completeness of God. Here, personal inadequacies are magnified, prompting deeper introspection and humility necessary for true spiritual maturity. Yet regression threatens through Ahaz he has grasped, symbolizing the reappearance of old egoic attachments and familiar weaknesses. This stage marks the soul's temptation to retreat to former patterns and false comforts amid intense purification. Although unsettling, this regression ultimately serves to test authenticity and resolve, highlighting what still must be surrendered. From this renewed testing emerges Hezekiah, meaning Yahweh strengthens. Here, the soul reclaims spiritual resolve, decisively overcoming regressions by relying completely on divine support. Inner strength is renewed, enabling the individual to transcend prior weakness with fortified faith and determination. This renewed strength enables the crucial spiritual stage of ego forgetting, represented by Manasseh, causing to forget. The lower self and ego-based identity dissolve profoundly, allowing the soul to detach from personal narratives, grievances, and identities previously held. Forgetting here symbolizes freedom from bondage to past identities, preparing the soul for deeper alignment with divine identity. Following ego dissolution, disciplined spiritual refinement emerges through Amen, meaning trained, faithful, skilled. Here the soul deliberately cultivates practices, disciplines, and virtues aligned to divine intention. Spiritual skillfulness is developed, fostering stability, consistency, and reliability in following divine principles. Purification deepens further through Josiah, translating as Yahweh heals. Josiah's stage marks thorough spiritual cleansing and healing following ego death. Authentic spiritual renewal now occurs as divine grace penetrates deeply, healing wounds left by egoic dissolution and bringing genuine spiritual purity to the surface. Finally, Jeconiah, Yahweh establishes, marks stabilization within divine order before emergence. At this stage, the soul experiences profound spiritual stabilization, firmly rooted in divine presence. Having navigated intense purification, it now rests confidently, firmly aligned and awaiting rebirth. This second trimester of the journey from Solomon to Jeconiah represents the soul's spiritual wilderness, a profound inner exile and necessary crisis leading toward deeper self-understanding and humility. The journey begins with peacefulness and seemingly strong spiritual identity, but quickly encounters instability, temptation, and ego collapse. This middle arc is marked by profound introspection, healing crises, and rigorous purification, necessary stages in genuine spiritual growth. What initially appears as collapse is, in truth, divine initiation. As illusions crumble, the soul recognizes its true strength lies not in personal power, but in its authentic surrender and alignment with divine will. By the end of this stage, purified and humbled, the soul stands stabilized and prepared for ultimate rebirth. It has traversed darkness and emerged refined, purified, and now fully ready for the final ascension toward complete integration and divine embodiment. The final arc opens with Shealtiel, meaning I have asked of God. The Hebrew characters shall, to ask, and al, God, signify a soul now fully awakened to a profound longing for reunification. At this stage, spiritual yearning becomes the dominant consciousness. The individual earnestly petitions the divine for restoration, signaling readiness for the final ascent. Prayer and yearning ignite the internal pathway toward reunion. Emerging from this intense yearning, the soul enters Zerubbabel, the seed of Babylon. Zerubbabel symbolizes spiritual rebirth initiated precisely amid exile and seeming darkness. The Hebrew zer, seed, implies a new divine identity planted within adversity, affirming the truth that profound spiritual realization frequently originates in shadow. This stage is acceptance and integration of darkness as fertile soil for divine growth. Then comes Abiud, meaning my Father is majesty or glory. Abiud represents the soul recognizing its innate nobility and inherent glory, rooted directly in divine lineage. This stage awakens deep spiritual self-recognition, the realization of divine inheritance not as distant abstraction but intimate identity. Nobility within becomes clearer, further dissolving residual feelings of inadequacy or unworthiness. From nobility emerges Eliakim, meaning God raises up. Eliakim embodies spiritual resurrection following ego death and purification. The Hebrew al, God, and kvm, raise up, explicitly denote divine elevation. The soul experiences powerful rejuvenation, consciously lifted into higher realms of spiritual awareness, reborn and emerging from the ashes of previous limitations into new spiritual stature. Divine assistance then crystallizes through Azor, meaning helper. Derived from Ziyah, help, Azor signifies the realization that divine aid is continually present. Here, trust deepens. The soul learns to rely fully on subtle, unseen guidance, transcending rational control. This stage marks a decisive shift toward trustful surrender and profound confidence in the divine presence guiding each step. Now comes alignment with divine law in Zadok, meaning righteous. Zadok embodies full embodiment of spiritual integrity and justice. Here, alignment with universal divine principles becomes absolute. Ethical purity and unwavering devotion to divine truth guide all choices. This is spiritual coherence, where internal righteousness aligns effortlessly with external action. Following righteousness emerges communal awakening represented by Akim, my brothers rise. Akim emphasizes a widening spiritual consciousness, embracing collective unity. Spiritual realization no longer remains individual but extends into compassion and a broader recognition of interconnectedness. Here, spirituality naturally moves toward communal upliftment and empathy, dissolving barriers between self and others. This expanded communal awareness becomes perpetual worship through Eliud, meaning God is my praise. Eliud marks the stage where life itself transforms entirely into an ongoing expression of praise and reverence. Each moment becomes sacramental, lived in continual awareness of divine beauty. Worship ceases to be merely action. It becomes the soul's permanent state of being. Continuous gratitude unfolds further with Eleazar, meaning God has helped. The soul embodies gratitude incarnate, profoundly aware of constant divine support. Eleazar signifies a deeper realization of divine providence in every detail of existence, acknowledging divine sustenance behind every event. Gratitude itself becomes a powerful, transformative force, sustaining spiritual growth and joy. From gratitude emerges overflowing grace, symbolized by Mathan, gift. Derived from NTN, to give. Mathan marks spiritual generosity and fecundity, the soul now embodying abundant grace that freely flows outward. Life becomes selfless giving, characterized by boundless generosity and openness, freely bestowing divine love and light without limitation or expectation. Yet, just before complete union, the soul experiences its final struggle again through Jacob, he who grasps the heel. Jacob's recurrence signifies one last veil of subtle attachment, symbolized by the Hebrew root KB, heel, to follow closely, representing residual ego resistance. This final wrestling is critical, stripping away the subtlest spiritual pride, attachments, and lingering identities that hinder full union. This struggle yields to Joseph. He will add or increase. Joseph symbolizes the exponential expansion of spiritual illumination within the individual. The Hebrew YSP implies endless increase, as divine presence permeates and multiplies within the soul. The self expands far beyond individual boundaries, now becoming an expansive channel for divine illumination, consciousness expanding infinitely outward. The penultimate stage is represented by Mary, a name rich in complexity, variously interpreted as bitterness, sea, or wished-for child. Mary symbolizes the soul's final spiritual travail, a paradoxical stage blending pain, immersion in profound spiritual mystery, and fulfillment of divine promise. Here, the soul fully surrenders all remaining resistance, deeply immersed in spiritual mystery, and undergoing final transformative labor pains necessary for divine realization. The journey culminates fully in Jesus, meaning Yahweh saves. Derived from YSH, to deliver, save, Jesus symbolizes the moment of complete spiritual rebirth and the embodiment of the divine logos within. The soul is no longer merely aware of the divine, it is unified consciously as divine. The incarnation of Christ is no longer external history, but internal reality. The Logos fully emerges within the heart, culminating the journey of reunification with the divine. The final 14 steps of the ascent describe not merely a process, but the consummation of spiritual ascension. The soul's journey here emphasizes active surrender, communal consciousness, gratitude, selfless giving, and ultimate realization of oneness. Hebrew character meanings profoundly reinforce this ascent. Each ancestral name becomes a precise spiritual marker, guiding the soul progressively toward full reunification with divine essence. At the journey's climax, Christ is born within, not merely as belief, but as conscious realization. This is the ultimate significance of Matthew's genealogy. Through each spiritual step, yearning, rebirth, recognition of glory, resurrection, assistance, righteousness, communal unity, worship, gratitude, generosity, final struggle, and ultimate expansive realization, the soul embodies the living Logos. In the sacred architecture of Matthew's genealogy, we find not merely a record of lineage, but a map of human transformation, an intricate unveiling of the divine path etched into the human soul. This triadic progression of 42 names, anchored in Hebrew meaning and sacred numerology, reveals the deep anatomy of spiritual becoming. From Abraham's first awakening to Christ's divine emergence, the text encodes the journey of the soul from divine potential to divine embodiment. What begins as a spark of covenantal calling in Abraham becomes a transformative spiral, a cycle of joy, struggle, purification, collapse, resurrection, and ultimately incarnation. Each ancestral name is a mirror. Each step reflects a universal aspect of inner passage. The text reveals that the path toward the divine is not a straight ascent, but a dynamic dance between contraction and expansion, between forgetting and remembering, between self-emptying and divine fulfillment. The movement from Abraham to David shows the soul awakening to its belovedness. The movement from Solomon to Jeconiah reflects the soul's descent into purification and inner exile. The final arc from Shealtiel to Jesus marks the return, where yearning, surrender, and radical transformation yield to full integration of the Logos within. This is the heart of the journey, not to escape the world, but to illuminate it from within by becoming the dwelling place of the divine. Thus, the genealogy culminates not in history, but in the present tense of incarnation. The soul, having passed through every portal of name and meaning, emerges as Christ-bearing, where the divine is not merely known, but lived. In this final convergence, the names no longer point backward. They become archetypes in us, keys in the architecture of our own unfolding. The genealogy, then, is not simply Christ's. It is humanity's. It is ours.